This is the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Today on the program, we're talking about gluttony in all its many forms. With us again as our spiritual director is Father Carter Griffin. Father Griffin's the rector of St. John Paul II Seminary in Washington, D.C., and has published 4 books, including most recently, Forming Families, Forming Saints. Welcome back to the show, Father, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Patrick. It's good to be back with you.
Why don't you outline for us, what are we actually talking about when we're talking about the sin of gluttony?
Sure. Yeah, it's. I suppose one way to think about it is that there's kind of the narrow or technical definition of gluttony, and then there's the broader one. The narrow one is, gluttony is about eating, eating and drinking immoderately, inordinately, contrary to reason. And of course, temperance is a virtue that helps to regulate some of those tendencies. There's an interesting section in St. Thomas Aquinas where he talks about the different forms of gluttony, and we know the one of eating too much. But you can also experience gluttony or have gluttony with eating at the wrong times, for instance, a lot of snacking, or how you eat sort of ravenously, things like that. Daintily, kind of being a little too particular about things, or sort of sumptuously, but also kind of focusing too much on it, spending too much money on it, spending a lot of time, in a way that's excessive. So anyway, these are all different ways we can talk about gluttony. I would say more broadly, though, it would be different appetites that we could consume in a gluttonous way, or in a way that's analogous to gluttony. So we talk about, it could be any kinds of different sort of drugs, even sort of fairly mild ones like caffeine. We could overdo that, or obviously alcohol, different other kinds of drugs, illegal drugs.
Yep.
Also, like the digital world, think about that gluttony, just the nonstop YouTube videos, TikTok, whatever it might be, just kind of people spending 2, 3, 4 hours a day. That could be another one. There's even a way that people have talked about spiritual gluttony, where we have a sort of a gluttony around devotions and things like that. So anyway, it's a huge topic, but, just to focus maybe on the narrow, but then also touching on some of the wider perspective too.
Yeah, and that's just it. And why are we so given to all these different types of pleasures or distractions? What is it about the appetites that become basically a fodder for the devil to tempt us and to overindulge?
Right. And I think the evil one does certainly tempt us with this. But we actually have all of the resources for sin already within us.
Sure.
We don't need his help.
Good point.
So I think that's part of the answer is that, going back to original sin where our appetites became kind of out of whack. Adam and Eve before the fall wouldn't have had this problem. They would have had the same appetite, but would have been perfectly ordered to reason. In original sin, our intellect became darkened, so we don't see things as clearly. Our will became weakened, so we can't choose the good as easily. But also our passions were no longer strictly under the governance of intellect and will. So I think that's part of the reason is that we have the kind of what they call the kindling of sin within us already with concupiscence. The other thing is that, of course, the appetites are drawn towards things that are at least in some way good for us, right? This is an obvious example, right? For food, right? We all need this to nourish ourselves in order to stay alive. And the other aspect that temperance deals with is in the sexual appetite. So the gluttony and chastity and temperance in the area of abstinence with respect to food always have gone together. And in fact, sometimes they can fuel each other too, which may be part of what we want to talk about.
Well, Father Griffin, as we think about these different forms of gluttony, let's go back to the eating one, because that's one that really has reared its head in the West, and maybe most particularly in America these days, where there's a lot of talk, there has been for years, about the obesity epidemic in our country today, this overindulgence. And do you particularly see any reason why we can go, maybe in the course of just a century, from being relatively fit and in shape to kind of in this place where we're a gluttonous society?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think that it's part of a wider issue of just the prosperity in which we live, at least in this part of the world. Prosperity tends to sort of feed into some of these appetites. And there's a kind of an encouragement of sorts around unrestrained behavior, I think, just in general. So I think this is part of that. But there are other very particular things too. Like we have a lot more sugar in the foods that we eat, and as every study shows, that's just something that we don't do very well with, right? We kind of tend to, we don't limit ourselves very easily when it comes to sugary foods. And the fact that we live a lot longer, we're less susceptible to diseases and things like that. We tend not to be sick for as long. And I think just our bodies historically have kind of gotten used to a lot more times of sort of enforced fasting, either because there wasn't food around or because there wasn't enough money to buy food or because we were sick or whatever. Whereas I think we just live in such a time of prosperity, not just in terms of food, but just in terms of general bodily existence, that our body's just getting a lot more of nourishment than we actually need. So I think there's a lot of reasons. And interesting, I would also point out, like that's talking about like excessive food, but there's also this new movement, which is also very much a prosperity culture, sort of first world problem type thing, which is like the foodie culture, and this real focus on food, almost an obsession sometimes with food and what we're going to have, this restaurant we go to, and all the dainties and the delicacies. But there's nothing wrong with kind of people enjoying, a good meal. Not at all. In fact, that's actually part of a good, thriving human life, especially to do it with other people. But there is an excessive focus that can sometimes enter into some of these conversations. So I think from multiple angles, that this vice is a little bit harder to overcome today than in previous ages.
All right. Well, since you brought it up, Father, and it's getting perhaps maybe it's touching a nerve with some folks. I don't necessarily consider myself a foodie, although I do definitely appreciate good food. You're right. This is a huge trend. Like a lot of people I know are on the foodie train, so to speak. So what is kind of the interrelationship between gluttony, as you were saying before, perhaps whether you say you were talking about St. Thomas Aquinas talking about eating too daintily or too sumptuously. So what's the interplay between gluttony when it comes to kind of the foodie culture?
I think the first thing is an awareness, right? An awareness that it needs to be, just because I'm not having a lot of food, it doesn't mean that I'm living a perfectly virtuous approach to food. And so I suppose just like somebody who has a tendency to overeat, somebody who has a tendency to kind of focus a lot on what they're eating or, counting every calorie when it's not strictly speaking necessary, or every ingredient has to be organically, whatever it might be, whatever my thing happens to be. And I'm not talking about medical situations. I'm just saying about personal preferences.
Sure.
So it's a temperance thing. I was looking back at how much of my day did I spend obsessing about food? I mean, how much did I think about it? And was it really ordered towards something that was rational or under the domain of reason? Or has it just become kind of something habitual and contributing to almost like a scrupulous approach to food? Like, well, I can't eat it if it's not prepared in these different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just being cautious about that, working against it, just like we would have to work against overeating, trying to grow in the virtues of, in the case of overeating, it's like abstinence, is what we call the kind of temperance with respect to food. But I would say that there is a kind of abstinence, the equivalent virtue, for those who have an excessive focus on food and trying to focus on other things. One of the things I think just in general about temperance is that it's definitely one of these virtues that is best overcome, I think, not just by sort of the frontal assault, but by kind of crowding it out. It's filling it with other dimensions of our life that maybe are going underappreciated. But I think crowding it out rather than sort of suppressing it, tends to be the best way.
Yeah, interesting. I like that. Yeah. Father, we had an email to come in from Robert, who's listening in Madison, Wisconsin on 1240 AM. And Robert says this, he says, I'm wondering if willed fasting helps with gluttony and gluttonous desires.
It certainly does. Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the ways that we can sort of push back against sort of the clamor and the demands, of the appetite, particularly the appetite for food. So yeah, I think one of the ways, it's not just in kind of willing temperance for its own sake. That's obviously going to be a part of this, growing and learning how to have the right amount of food, the right time, the right way, and all the rest of it. But also sometimes, actually, strictly speaking, not eating as much as we want to in a way that is fasting. I think there's two things. First of all, it kind of resets our internal kind of appetite clock. But it also, if it's done for supernatural motives and with grace, then we also receive that kind of assistance from God, for living in that way, because we fast not only to kind of grow in self-discipline, but we fast as a way of sacrificing, and we sacrifice good things, to God for his blessing. So yeah, there's a supernatural and a natural dimension to how fasting can help.
Okay, very good. I like that. Robert, hope that helps. Thanks so much for the email. Hi, this is Patrick Conley. You can join me and listen on the Relevant Radio app to The Inner Life, live each weekday at 11 a.m. Central. And thanks for listening.